Hello, this is Georgina Rose.
This is Nike.
This is Anthony.
And welcome to Magnolias and Magick. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that we've sort of touched on here and there, but we wanted to sort of make a full episode on because it's something that's a perennial issue and one that I think is a little bit more relevant as the community sort of exits the pandemic and the popularity of the community seems to be a bit lower than it was this time a year ago. And that would be consumerism and the popularization of witchcraft, the occult, paganism, though specifically witchcraft. You see it the most with witchcraft. Over the past 2-3 years now, actually, honestly, over the past decade, there has been a progressive increase in interest in the occult, with it peaking in the pandemic about last year and it now starting to drop off a little bit. And that has sort of raised a lot of questions because when you have a lot of new people coming into the occult, you see the topic trending. It was even the header of TikTok, #WitchTalk. A lot of people are going to take interest in this. There's been a huge rise in media pieces such as the Washington Post, Vice, all these sort of outlets doing pieces on the occult. And because of that, I mean, obviously companies take interest. We live in a market economy. People are going to want to profit off things. And so there's been a rise of consumerism in the occult. This is not something completely new, but it's increased. We want to talk about that. We often sort of see this as a very bad thing, but I think there's actually a little bit more nuance to it. And I think this honestly raises a larger conversation about the changing of the guard that's going on right now and the transition from what the community was before, and honestly before the social media revolution, to what it looks like now. And so I think while we are talking about consumerism, we're honestly touching on something a lot bigger and a lot more complex when we break into these topics. So let's break into it.
I think that we all know that it became popular during the pandemic because people were inside and, global crises tend to push people towards religion, and that's what this was. It was a global crisis, and there's a lot of death, and so that intertwines a lot of religious history and things like that. So obviously we know that the pandemic really made it bigger, and that is a large part of it. But I think people are also now finding ways to just step away from the norm, in part because of the way that COVID has changed all of our lives. So people really want to find something different. They want to find a different solution. They want to step away from old belief systems because clearly everything we knew that we thought had to be the way it had to be doesn't. So I think that's a large part of it. But there's also new ways to understand how you can run your own life in some ways with jobs. And I think that there is something to be said about people finding both like a religious wholeness in what they are doing with paganism and witchcraft, but there's also marketability. There are skills that you can pick up and sell, and you can do things online. Obviously, we are content creators in the pagan witchcraft space, and it does give us some small amount of money to be able to do it through YouTube and Patreon and all those kinds of things. There's a way to be able to make it a larger part of your life monetarily. So there's also that tarot readings and astrology readings and all those things that come with it. So there are also other ways of understanding how your work life can look, not just your religious and spiritual life. And that was a big change that came with the pandemic.
Yeah, a couple months ago, I sat down with the Financial Times and talked about like why I think this has been a trend. I think that it's actually, I think it goes back a lot longer because people have this conception, and it's a complete myth, that whenever interest in conventional spirituality and religion declines, that enchantment or in a belief in spirituality or mysticism or religion just drops off. There's an entire book on it called The Myth of Disenchantment that I highly recommend reading. It tracks it through history, basically about all these times that we've sort of written off as when rationality has sort of surpassed and risen over religion. There has always been things in the fringes sort of that were occult. It gets into like the spiritualism movement and a lot of really interesting stuff. And another trend beyond the fact that people get interested in the occult when, mainstream religion is in decline, there's a historic correlation between hard times and religious interest. And there always has been. Because when life is hard, people focus on what really matters, right? These sort of very trivial worries and pains, as people used to call them, first world problems, kind of go to the backbone, the back of the room, and people focus on their family, their values. And when you're in a hard position, you're going to start thinking about the big questions in life. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that during this past bit of time that has been very hard, no matter what you believe, no matter where you're from, there's a lot going on in the world that's very, very scary. To the point where people have called this like the end times. I've seen Hindus say it's the Kali Yuga, like all this stuff. People have, thrown spirituality onto that. And I think that people seek religion when they need it. And I think occultism is a very fitting religion for these times because we are living in post-modernity, like it or not. And people feel very disconnected from older forms of religion. And so it makes sense that people would seek for something more like a more individualistic spirituality, which the idea of sort of individualistic spirituality is kind of a descent of theosophy and the traditions that came out of that. And on the other hand, you see this interest in paganism, which is people longing for something much more ancient. They want to see what their ancestors were doing and connect to that. And sort of, I think that the interest in paganism in particular is really interesting because we're craving paganism, which has a large correlation with earth-based spirituality during the age of essentially like intense technology, to the point where technology has overtaken our lives and Mark Zuckerberg's trying to create the metaverse, which is essentially like completely derooting our lives into technology. And so I think the fact that individualistic new agey spirituality and paganism are resurfacing now makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a much bigger thing than just people saw it trending on social media and were drawn to it, because for it to trend, for it to do that alone, people had to have had a collective interest. And I think that collective interest is actually valid and a good thing. But the thing is, though, people do, they take advantage of that. Like, people see a big rising trend and, some people are going to capitalize. Like, that's kind of just human nature. We're a bit opportunistic. And so I think that's sort of the crux of it.
Right. Well, I mean, a thing that I think a lot about too is I actually heard about this in a podcast the other day too, where essentially this it was funny. It was actually on a writing podcast, and so this author, she was talking about like how like she's a practicing Wiccan, and so she was talking about how it influences her like daily life and career and stuff. And it was interesting listening to like, because the podcast had nothing to do with the occult, and so it was interesting listening to like this like normie like have the occult explained to them essentially. But what that Wiccan author was saying is that like, because that's what the conversation stemmed into too, is like, why has like paganism and the occult started trending on like why is Vice Media like writing articles about this, like why do we see astrology everywhere, like why does Sephora have like a witch kit like in their makeup department, like all these different things, why has it become so big? And what the author was saying, her theory was that people, like, we live in a time where like we have to deal with all of these like horrible political things all came to a head at the same time, mixed with like all of this like climate damage and like military like shit happening all over the world. And so we're just living in this incredibly turbulent time where like, especially like we talked about, we live in the age of like the technological age now, like people don't have a lot of framework for dealing with that onslaught of like just constant bombardment of like horrible news, and like we're not physically meant to process that much horrible shit at the same time. And so especially in the modern day, younger people don't really have like a good method of dealing with that. And so a lot of people turned to things like paganism, for example. Like I think we were going to talk about this a little bit later, but like how paganism and like witchcraft have become a form of like self-help. Like she was saying she thinks a lot of people have turned to it as a way to manage like all of their feelings that they're going through. And like this feeling, especially like witchcraft, it's a way of like taking back power, people dealing with these feelings of like being powerless or not being able to control their circumstances, or like their loved ones are dying, or people are getting sick, or like the climate's falling apart. Like you were saying, like it's interesting, we're going to paganism in the age of technology because it's like going back to like earth-based practices. I think that's part of it too, is like our generation sees the climate falling apart, and so paganism is like literally a spiritual system designed to like connect with nature. And so for the right type of person, I could see why that would be really fulfilling.
And the self-care angle is interesting because something that I've said a few times is that witchcraft, the occult, is more than self-care. And I think that that's true. But just because it is more than self-care, and I don't like when witchcraft and stuff get diluted to just self-care, that doesn't mean self-care isn't part of that. I saw the author of The Little Work talking on Twitter a while ago. I think it was him, may not have been him. I'm sorry if I'm attributing this wrong. But they were like, yes, witchcraft is more than healing and self-help, but it should be helping you, right? The goal of, if say you're a Thelemite, you're trying to find your true will and achieve the great work and all this stuff, finding your true will should make your life better. It should heal you in a sense, and it should help you grow. That's part of the point, right? Like, even in more traditional religious systems, like, say, Christianity, right? And I mean, like, mainline Christianity, you're still supposed to feel relief when you connect to the love of Jesus, and it's still supposed to help you, right? Spirituality, there is shadow work, there are hard aspects to it, but overall, it should make your life better, right? Getting closeness to divinity, no matter what sort of system or framework or lens you're seeing this through, it should. Self-help is sort of part of it. It's not all of it, but it is a part of it. And I think that we should recognize that and give that some respect.
The comments about the like what this generation is seeing and why they're drawn to some of these things, I think it's interesting because we see such generational differences obviously across the board, but especially in witchcraft we see some really specific ways that the different generations will differ in their maybe even like their own philosophies and views on materialism and witchcraft. And for a while there was much more of the love and light idea, especially in like the 90s and 2000s, of you're not supposed to commodify your craft. You're not supposed to sell tarot readings or astrology because they're sacred, and you're not supposed to do bad things because that's bad, and it's supposed to only be for like good sweet things. And now we're watching this new generation because like the older generations watch so much war happen and all they want is peace, and what the current generations are seeing is much more of there is injustice everywhere and nothing's working. No one's doing anything. So it's much more of like, I'm not going to say vengeance, but trying to get justice. It really is. And so it's a lot more of a harsher way of going at things. It's part of why when we covered the hex positivity thing last week, it ties into that too. But it's just a really different view on what you can use these things for and why it matters and what about it is important, and finding peace in a different way through religion and different spirits that you can turn to. The generational differences are really, really, really clear. And it ties in with the self-help stuff as well because this generation also has a much better understanding of mental health is important. We need to be taking care of our minds in whatever way you see that as. I'm not going to say brain, but like our minds and the way that those function. And so the self-help part does tie into that too, where there's less stigma about mental health and all of those things, and it becomes part of the craft with shadow work and with incorporating therapy and finding peace and acceptance from your gods and your spirits and your ancestors. And healing generational trauma has been a really, really big thing. I mean, heck, we saw it with Encanto, which was an entire movie about generational trauma. And so these are really big themes that are starting to crop up, and so you can see the shifts going from one thing to another and how that gets reflected in witchcraft. And sometimes this really upsets older generations because we're no longer doing it the way that they're used to.
Well, Thelema has a big issue with this. So there's one Thelemic organization, one that I'm not part of and have never been part of, called the AA, that has this oath where you have to basically agree to not take money for teaching. Though some Thelemites kind of push it and be like, as long as you're not teaching AA material, it's fine. Regardless, a lot of older Thelemites have this belief that you can't charge for anything in the occult. And I think that that's a lovely philosophy if that's something you want to follow. But let's be honest about socioeconomics. The older generations have had a way easier time with money than my generation was. Look, like, I am a Zoomer. I am solidly Gen Z. I'm not a millennial. And my generation is very economically bad. Like, we were growing up during the recession, right? That was like our childhood was during the 2008 recession. That's where we were really growing up and like learning how life works for the first time. A lot of people in my generation, they grew up in a rough financial spot just because the recession really messed up their parents. And as they got older, they didn't have the same opportunities that older generations had. Like, so many people I know who are of my age, like, they won't have the option to ever raise kids on one income, for instance. Like, that was something that was somewhat normalized for so long, and people won't have that anymore. People are, in my generation, even turning against the idea of college. Like, you see a lot of Gen Z people sort of rejecting like higher education as a financial choice. And, we really are economically not where our previous generations are. Like, I don't know people who really are buying houses who are my age. I don't think I know anyone my age who like has a house at this point. So, yeah, I think that it is not surprising that people who are of my age range are a lot more relaxed with this idea of charging money for things, right? Like, I believe it's an energy exchange. Someone has put energy into teaching you, and you're giving them the energy of your labor back. I think that there are people who scam people by way overcharging, and I think that's a serious problem. Not trying to deny that. But I think this lofty idea that no spiritual worker should ever charge for what they're doing is just not great, because it is work. Spiritual work is work. And if you're someone who's like, making custom candles for people day in and day out and running a reading group that meets for hours every week, and you asking for like a little bit of money for that, I don't think that's some mortal, ideological, esoteric sin. I think it's just a practical reality. I think that for previous generations that may have worked out. I wish I was a boomer too. They had it so much easier in this regard. But I think that it's just not always realistic. And I think that there is a level of, being out of touch financially with the reality of young people when this
Mhm.
discourse comes up.
Well, I mean, I can see that playing out in several, like some things that just popped into my mind. Like, I can see that playing out in multiple areas of the occult community, not just like definitely in that like financial aspect of like I've heard that from the AA before about how like they require their members to like not like make any money off of what they teach, and like I could definitely see that applying there. But like taking it even further, like oh, what is one thing I'm trying to think of? Like, how we're talking about these differences between like why older generations are like out of touch with just the way that the world works for younger generations. And so like we get into these arguments about how younger people take the craft and then transpose it onto whatever our circumstances are now. And there's like almost a disconnect. Like we don't understand, like the two different generations aren't able to see eye to eye. And like another place I can see that playing out is like a lot of older books talk about how you need to have very specific sets of tools. You need to have like certain, like you have to have a chalice made out of a very particular alloy that's made out of like a certain percentage of gold, and like has to be encrusted with emeralds and like certain positions, blessed under like a certain star sign, like all these very specific parameters that made perfect sense for those circumstances when those books were written. But like in context, those books were written for very, very wealthy upper class people to practice occultism amongst very wealthy upper class people. But now in the modern day, when occultism has bled down more into like our generation, for example, we have to take that and adapt it to whatever works for us. And so you people see people using like solo cups for a chalice, for example. Or like another way I could, like, this is a little bit more shaky example, but like I know a lot of older practitioners. There was like this almost like I hesitate to say aesthetic, but like there was this vibe of like you're like, it's the whole to keep silent thing. Like if you practice occultism, you're not supposed to share that, you're not supposed to be vocal about it. Like I know a lot of people back in the day, like yeah, they had to worry about McCarthyism, they had to worry about like being outed at their jobs, they had to worry about like kids being taken away. But we don't have to worry about those things now. And so like I don't see this so much anymore, but maybe in like older Facebook groups or on Tumblr I used to see this argument a lot of older practitioners getting mad at people like us who would like come on and make content or like talk about occultism or try to disseminate it like in this very, very public sphere of social media. And they would say exactly what we're arguing about today is like, you're commodifying the craft, you're diluting it, you're spreading it amongst people who are not ready to hear it or who are going to fuck the message up. But like you could take that and run it with nuance of like, okay, well, the first thing I think of is like J. Allen Cross, who like he wrote a book of like all these different types of like folklore traditions who like have never been documented before, especially not in English. And so like this, for essentially that he was documenting this craft for the sake of preserving it and spreading it to people who would never be able to access it any other way, even though it's kind of their birthright. And so like how can you argue like, is that a bad thing that he's like not keeping these practices silent? Like and so there's just so much nuance that comes into this conversation when you start thinking about like the socioeconomic situation we live in, like the value, like you guys are saying, the values that we just have as a generation, like it's just very, very different now.
I have really strong opinions on, like, when I hear people saying that we shouldn't commodify any form of spirituality ever at all, I have a really hot take that I think it is actually more benefit to us to make it a little bit watered down in the social perception, but normalized. I think it does way more good to in a sense, commodify it. Because, yes, commodification is going to happen when things become popular, but it means that they're popular and they're safe and normal. They're normal enough that companies feel comfortable doing the Sephora witch kit and all these different things and the Barnes and Noble witch talk displays and whatever. It's easier and safer for people to go to access it. So now they don't have to worry about getting kicked out of their homes and getting disowned from their families and getting into really dangerous situations and having their whole lives uprooted. If it's super normal, the way that Wicca almost is now for the most part, if it's normal, okay, yeah, wine, that people are going to make money off of it and it's going to be commodified and whatever. They already do that with Christianity. And we're not going around telling Christians that their religion no longer means anything and that they shouldn't practice it because it's being commodified. Nobody tells them that. Nobody. Nobody who is religious tells Christians that they shouldn't do it because it's been commodified and there's like Jesus music and Jesus shirts and Jesus merch and all this stuff. Like, nobody says that. So as much as it may hurt to see something that feels so sacred because now it's happening to you, it used to be something you could look at from the outside perspective. Now it's happening to you and it sucks and it hurts, but it normalizes it and makes it acceptable to do in the first place. So, okay, companies make a little bit of a profit off like a witch talk display or whatever, and there's some cheaply made products that aren't really all that good. But if you're actually in it to be in it, you're going to know how to get the proper stuff anyway. And it makes things easier to access in the first place. So if you don't want to have a solo cup chalice, well, if fucking Home Goods starts carrying around things that are specifically labeled chalices, great. Isn't that good that you'll be able to get something that is cheaper and looks nicer and you don't have to worry about like spending $100 on Etsy? It's better for it to be commodified and commercialized to some extent because it means that it's normal.
Look, it's look, there is a lot of cringeworthy stuff that has come out of this commodification stuff. Like, let's be real, the Sephora witch kit, very cringe. But I would rather cringe at stuff than be worried that I'm gonna get wrongfully arrested for being a Satanist. Like, to be honest, it's the lesser of two evils, and honestly, you can't undo what's been done. There is no putting the genie back into the bottle. The occult is decentralized. We are living in the age of decentralization. There is no way that we are going back to what it was in the Victorian era, where everyone was in orders. And to be honest, you want to know who actually really started all this? Crowley. Do you know what Crowley did when he left the Golden Dawn? He published and released the material to the masses. He went against what everyone wanted to do. And sure, he talked about keeping silent, but he was the first person to say, fuck you, and release all the materials. And all his AA materials is published in the Equinox because there are going to be people who see this material, they make it fluffy, and there are going to be people who fuck it up. But in the world, people need to be able to scrape their knees in order to learn. I don't think we should paternalize people and hide all this information from them. I think that if people are going to be idiots, they're going to be idiots whether you tell them about it or not. So that's why I think, sure, I'm going to recommend and like not talk about very specific things, but I'm never going to try to really hide it from people. I mean, I've talked about the Goetia and Enochian on a public platform. So, some people I'm sure have watched those videos and made spiritual mistakes after watching it. But I think that's better. I think that that is better than going back into hiding. And there's no way to undo what's been done. I think what we need to do is adapt. We need to adapt to the current situation and make our community better and fit for learning today. Because we're not going back. There is no return. The return is a cope. It's not happening. So we need to learn to make our current situation work and give the best quality teaching and community using the circumstances that we have. Because screaming about how the Zoomers are ruining everything with no solution isn't helping. It's a waste of time. And I want to see the solutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the thing is, too, is like, it would be one thing if we were like talking about like if it wasn't occultism, like if I can't even think of a good solution or a good example, like crypto or something like something that like doesn't inherently add value to like people's lives. But like, we're not peddling like snake oil. We're like talking about our spiritual system, which like we started this show by saying like this is something that tends to be pretty uplifting for people. Like it's especially like with witchcraft, like it has a lot of feminist themes that run in it. It has a lot of queer themes that run in it. It has a lot of representation for minorities a lot of times. And so like these are things that do add value to a lot of people's lives. And like you guys were saying, like being able not necessarily to commodify it, but like the fact that it's become popularized and so easily available and accessible, like that is like objectively a good thing. Like maybe not entirely, but like there are objectively good parts to that because it spreads that to those disenfranchised communities. And like the one example, like this is a very extreme example, but like one thing that has stuck with me since it happened a couple years ago was this was when I was very big on Instagram, or not very big on Instagram, when I was focusing a lot on Instagram. I was building my platform up. I was posting like content like every single day, like I was doing like diary entries of my craft and like talking about different spell workings that I was doing, and like just trying to be as educational as possible and just be like a good representation of my practice. And I got a lot of engagement with a lot of really cool people who would say like, oh my God, this is so informational, thank you so much, blah blah blah. But then there was this one particular woman who messaged me one day, and I couldn't get like the full information from her because like there was like a language barrier difference. But from what I gathered, she lived in Saudi Arabia, and she was a very young girl. I think she was like only 20 years old, but she was living in a very 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 conservative family. She was living in a very conservative family in a very conservative area. And in her area, she was talking about how like, yeah, here like women don't have rights, like we don't really get to do much of anything, we don't get a lot of education, like the fact that I'm even allowed to have a cell phone is kind of a big thing. And it just shows that my family, who like, she was talking about how like just these horrible things that they had done to certain women in her family before, like horribly sexist things. She was like, yeah, my family's actually kind of progressive just because like I get to have a cell phone. But she was explaining like she was in this situation where she was in love with this man who lived in a different country, and I guess they were like childhood sweethearts or whatever, but he lived in a different country, he wasn't Muslim. And so and it also, on top of that, she was already in a prearranged marriage from her parents. And she said like this had been fucking with her for like almost like 5 or 6 years now, because she's been trying to figure out a way that she could like smuggle herself out of the country and like run away from her family and like break all these like laws and shit, just so that she wouldn't be forced into this marriage, so that she could go be with this person she actually wanted to be with. And she said she got to a point where like she almost gave up, but then she found my Instagram account, and just it happened to pop up on her feed, and that was like her segue into like paganism. And she was like, oh my God, like I've never fucking, like, you have a religion that worships like women, like you think God is a female. And like this was the first time she had ever been exposed to a lot of these like very feminine empowerment like ideas that we just kind of take for granted in the Western world. And she said like that, like not specifically my account, but like paganism and like this new spiritual path she had found was what gave her the strength she needed to like get out of that situation. And she said like this was something that happened about like a year ago, so like I just wanted to say I am on the other side of this. I wanted to thank you for posting this kind of content. Like I wanted to communicate how much this means to me, and like thank you for changing my life essentially. And like that blew my fucking mind, because like like what, like we take for granted so many things here in the West. And like just that simple fact of like that helped her, like that changed her entire life just because of how empowering what we practice is. And so like, yeah, I absolutely think we should be sharing that with as many fucking people as we can.
In many ways, it does give people these new options of, I'm allowed to live in this new way, not just in the way of like being able to escape sexism and mainstream religions that tell you that life must be this one way, but also to accept yourself. The gods are gay, so maybe I'm not bad after all, and it can help to lead people into better, happier, self-accepting lives. And even if your family doesn't necessarily accept you, it can give you a light at the end of the tunnel that there could be something else out there, because a lot of people live and die under the fear of usually the Abrahamic gods, especially in radical Christian sects and radical Muslim sects. Um, the idea that maybe there could be a different option besides just whatever you've been around is really life saving. And so the commercialization and making it normal to be able to access the information about these things is huge for a lot of people. It's going to be really important. And so if it takes watering things down a little bit in the mainstream media, and you can't find the actual information through movies, boo-hoo, and they misrepresent it, but it's normal to talk about, I'll take it.
Well, actually, I got a comment on YouTube a while ago from a guy from an Islamic country, I don't remember which one, where he's like, we can't even get books on this in my country, and so I have to watch videos and podcasts, because almost all in English, because you can't consume this information because of how, totalitarian and repressive those nations are. and it really hit me in a way, and I remember reading it and being very touched, and it made me feel very grateful that we can complain about the witch talk display in Barnes and Noble, right? Like, it makes all our problems very trivial because there are people living in countries who are not as privileged as us here in the West and do not have the lives and the luckiness to be in these countries, who do not have the choice to go into a bookstore and buy a book on Wicca. Like, that's not accessible to everyone around the world. And, us in the West, we sometimes forget that and we focus on our country's problems and our problems within our own sphere, that we forget about the fact that there's an entire world and it's not the same across it. And, I think we should critique when people do commercialization wrong, right? Like, the Sephora Witch Kit. Let's talk about it because it made everyone really mad. It happened in 2018. Sephora and a perfume brand called Primrose released a kit of perfume samples with a rose quartz, a bundle of white sage, and tarot cards. And people got very mad. I think of course, there's the white sage thing. We've discussed that. I don't think we need a discussion on that again. I think we're all kind of aware of that. So that was kind of yikes. But, people got really mad and they're like, I don't like that these companies are using witchcraft as an aesthetic. And I think to an extent that's not really a good thing. Like, maybe don't get your first tarot deck from a perfume sampler. But in the end, it's a perfume sampler. I think that it is kind of sucky to see sacred religious objects be used to sell makeup. Like, yeah, doesn't feel great. But, it's not really hurting one. I actually think there are bigger problems in our community than this type of stuff. Like, this stuff is cringy, and there are definitely people who you could call grifters in our space who, they're only here because there's money, right? Like, those people definitely exist, though they're way more prominent in the New Age sphere because a lot more people are into the New Age than into, like, something as fringe as, say, Thelema, right? Like, the New Agers are where that stuff really sort of resides, but, that stuff's bad. But in the end, it's not the worst problem in the world, and it's not like grifters are new. That's the thing. I think some people frame this as if, like, spirituality grifters are something that, like, did not exist until 10 years ago. Like, you guys realize that the term snake oil salesman comes from the fact that people used to sell snake oil to people? Like, literal snake oil? In the Victorian era, the spiritualism movement, which spiritualism is not inherently bad, but there were actual spiritualist grifters that we have record of existing. There are people who, like, claim to do, like, I was watching the show Dark Tourist, which is a docu-series on Netflix. It's very good. And in one episode, they were doing a tour of places where Ted Bundy had killed people, and they were doing dowsing readings to try to talk to the victims there. The show's a little older. It's not within the past. It's pre-pandemic. And so shit like that, it's always existed. And we've seen, fake psychics on TV make those fuck-ups. I think we've all seen those videos where there was one, I don't remember which news show shared it, where someone, like, tricked a psychic into claiming that they thought someone was dead when they were alive. There have been people who are obvious grifters, but that doesn't mean that all of spirituality is a grift. And that doesn't mean that young people are ruining spirituality, because a lot of these people have been around for a long time. Wherever money is and wherever attention is, opportunists are going to follow it. And there are opportunists in Christianity. If you guys know about what's known as seed faith, which is where you, like, seed money in exchange for, like, healing. Like, I know there's one seed faith pastor who claims that he said to some woman who died of cancer that if you would have given more money to the church, you would have
Prosperity
lived.
gospel.
Prosperity gospel. Yeah, like, it's not just an occultism thing. It's a people fucking suck thing. And I think that we should go after it, across the board instead of being like, it's the Zoomers. It's the Zoomers.
Yeah. I think that we've already covered the accessibility and the open routes and the normalization and the safety aspects, but what are the other good things you think have come out of the commodification and popularity of the popularization of witchcraft and the occult?
I kind of think it's good that more people are interested in this stuff. You know what? Let's take a big view. A lot of the people in our community who are our leaders now got into the occult because of Wicca in the 90s and Silver Ravenwolf book Teen Witch. Let's use Matt Oren because he's one of the more popular occult authors. We've had him on the show. He wrote Psychic Witch, which everyone simps hard for that book. And he got into the occult because of people like Silva Ravenwolf. And the community at the time used to really shit on her and say that all the people she was getting into the occult were fluffy bunnies. They were not real occultists. And it's basically the equivalent of like, going on the internet and getting mad about like the e-girls with the lemon spells, right? Like the generation before us got shit on by the generation before them. It's just a cycle repeating. Like all the stuff people used to say about the eclectic fluffy bunnies, who multiple of them, I mean Devin Hunter, Matt Oren, Thorne Mooney, all these people were them, and they're now community leaders, coven leaders, holding events. Some people from this generation are going to become that. And so it's just, yeah, it's not a new thing. That's another thing that I always want to point out.
Well, I think something too that like some people don't take into consideration is that like a lot of this commodification and popularization, like it's not entirely our community's fault. Like it's almost just like a byproduct. I mean, you can put blame wherever you want, but like it's almost just a byproduct of us becoming like more normalized and like clashing with like the industrial complex of like social media and modern capitalism and like all of those things. Like they see like the popularity is what sets the initial like demand in the market, and then from there like you get Vice News who publishes like one article on astrology and suddenly 10,000 people want to like get like fucking tarot decks, and then like Sephora is like, oh my god, we can make millions of these fucking like little makeup kits and everyone will buy them, and then it's like a positive feedback loop that just keeps building and building and building, while like the normie world, I'm gonna start using that word, I guess, the normie world starts trying to figure out what to do with like our growing and almost like thriving like occultism community that's just becoming more and more popular with younger generations. And like they don't care about preserving it, they just care about exploiting it and making money off of it. And so like the thing is, the what am I trying to say, the oh, I was trying to use a fancy word, but I'm not going to remember what it is. The responsibility of what happens with that, like over the next 10 to 20 years, that falls on people like us and like people that will be coming after us, like Gen Z creators and whatever generation comes after Gen Z, like those creators of what they want to do with the community and the direction they want to take it in.
When things become more popular, they get diluted, because not everyone who gets into things are going to take it as seriously as other people. But that kind of raises a question. Do you have to be a serious occultist to be an occultist? Because I think that's one of these bigger underlying currents. You see it a lot in Thelema in particular. People get mad that people are getting into Thelema and not like joining a bunch of organizations and taking a bunch of oaths and moving really fast. And for a while I sort of shared this attitude. I was like, to be an occultist is to make it your entire life, to make it very seriously. And I've started thinking about it more and more, and I've met more people who are, less serious practitioners who in the past I probably would have looked down upon. Which I was a bit arrogant. You see, we have our Dun. I call it my Dunning Kruger arc, right? Like I kind of fell into that.
We're all
Fluffy
allowed to
bunnies
grow.
bad. Yeah, I felt like fluffy bunnies bad. Must be serious occultist. And then I sort of thought about it more, and I was in the community longer, and I've changed those beliefs. But I don't necessarily think someone needs to be a serious hardcore occultist to be in the community. I think like let's look at other religions. There are always going to be people who are like the devout, tradition loving, hardcore people. They'll always exist, but there always are going to be people who are like, yeah, I don't go to church too often, but I believe. Yeah, I don't do spells too often, but I'm still a witch. I think those people are a natural part of any spiritual community, and I don't think they're necessarily a problem. Do you guys think casual occultism is like a bad thing? Because I think that's something that does underscore this conversation.
No, I don't think casual occultism is bad. I think that it's perfectly normal, and we don't need to be the most very serious. It goes into the more complicated issue of feeling the need to commodify your practice versus having the practice as a whole commodified. The individual urge to commodify your practice automatically, I think, is a little bit more of an issue of I have to be a professional and it's the only reason I'm allowed to do anything. And that comes a lot more with like the capitalism issue. I think we are completely allowed to have a very casual relationship with witchcraft and divinity and all of that. We don't have to be the most serious. We don't have to be content creators. We don't have to be teaching and writing books and making it our jobs. You can just do it. You can just be a regular person with a regular job, little office job or a receptionist, and on the side, you believe in the gods and maybe you have a statue.
Well, that I see as a big thing on social media because a lot of these people, they're not joining groups. Like, let's be honest. like 90% of modern occultists are solitary, and I don't see that trend changing anytime soon. And so for a lot of these people, if they don't live in areas where they can meet other practitioners, their only real community is the internet. Their community is their TikTok, their Discord server, whatever. And so I think when you're on the internet, you feel this pressure to produce. And I think these solitary people, they want community, they're craving connection. And so they sort of push themselves into, say, doing content or running a community when they're new and they're not really ready to, because they see that as what they value. And and I think about it now, is this is really new, because I remember I was talking with someone else that for a long time, to gain credibility in the community, you had to have a book. And so people who didn't even really want to be writers were sort of pressured into writing occult books because that gave you that level of, clout. And so I think there's some of that in this too. And, I don't think you need to be a content creator to like the occult. And to be honest, being a content creator is kind of draining. And I could see being a content creator sort of make someone fall out of love with their spirituality in a weird way.
Absolutely. I mean, I've literally, like, in some of the interviews I did for the Living Grimoire last year, like, that was a pretty consistent thing I heard from almost everybody. I think the only one that didn't really, like, say that, like, the content creation had negatively impacted their spiritual practice in some way was Temperance. And that's because I think Temperance was in, like, a little bit of a lull period. Like, when I interviewed her, like, all she was really doing was, like, she was doing OWASP with y'all, and, like, other than, she was like, no, I feel great. Like, I'm barely on Instagram, I'm barely on Twitter. Like, there's not really a lot of drama. And so, but yeah, everyone else essentially said, like, yeah, when you have to, it's not even like, I think different parts of it mess with people in different ways, but like the common denominator that I would identify was like when you like, spirituality is something that I feel like a lot of people think like it has to come from like something within you, like it's something special, it's a way that you connect personally with like the divine, let's say. Like it's a very personal, deep, intimate connection that you have, that especially within paganism only really you understand. And then when you try to take that and commodify it and put it on the internet as something that has to be regularly consumed, it's like just like any other type of content creation, you just constantly have to be tapping into that reserve that up until that point was a private thing, but now it's a public thing. And so you're self-conscious about it, and you're thinking about how other people will think about it, and you're worried about getting canceled for it, which, like, it isn't just about getting canceled. It could be about losing your career and like your credibility, and like you're worried about like your normal life, finding like people from your school or your job or your family finding out about this other side of you. So like it's just taking something that is very sacred and very private and then like overworking it in a stressful environment. And
Oh,
like
if you become a content creator, I want to put this out there, or even if you post casually, you should be emotionally prepared for people to find it. Because I've had people in my real life find my content, uh, and they were people I wouldn't have expected to find it. And so I think that you should be aware. And my practice was really private for me for the first few years. Like, I didn't really tell anyone what I believed for a long time. I was very private about my beliefs. I kept them to myself. I told like some friends, like my family, like they knew I was kind of spiritual, but I didn't tell anyone the extent of it. It was in my own private life. Like I had my altar in a shoebox that people couldn't see. Like it was very private. And then as I gained freedom, I became an adult, right? I was like, oh, I can be more open about this. I started sort of seeking out community and reading the internet and whatnot. And I started then I made the choice to start making content. And you need to expect that people will find it, because they will. I think people should lead with the assumption that it should be found. And if you live a life where it being found poses a risk to you, because I have seen multiple people, when their occult stuff gets found, that cause serious problems in their life. I've seen it happen. I think you should be okay with that. To be honest, like I know that's cynical advice. I know that's advice that not everyone wants to hear, but if you gain any sort of traction, it's most likely people in your real life will find your stuff, and I think you should be prepared for that. And you should make sure your life is comfortable with it. My final thoughts are that our community is changing. There's a term you see in Thelema sometimes, the changing of the guard, where basically the community changes over, the generations move on, and times change. Because we are in a spot of change, right? The social media revolution happened, it's here. And as a community, we are in this spot. We have been covered by mainstream media. We have been normalized. We are in Barnes and Noble. We are open and out about our beliefs for really the first time. And I think that's the reality of the current situation. There is no going back from here. I don't see a way that the community can go back to what it was even in the 90s when solitary practice began. We're not going back. Really, ever since people started releasing order information in publishing, thanks Crowley, we've been on this path towards what I call decentralization. Our community is not centralized. There is no president or Vatican of witchcraft, and there's never going to be one. In the modern world, we are a very individualistic world, like it or not. And all this stuff is because of that. It's because of the conditions of our community and our world. And if we want our community to be good, which I think we all want that, we need to face reality. You're not going to make a community better if you're not in tune with the reality of the situation. We're not going back to witchcraft never being bought and sold. It's just not going to happen. And I think that we should be talking about how can we sell ethically? How can we make the commodification not shitty? How can we avoid Sephora witch kits and instead release good books or release tarot decks that are, at an affordable rate or something like that? That's where our conversations could be instead of being like oh no, it's so bad, so scary, woo, Zoomers, so scary. Because it's a waste of energy in the end, right? It's easy to see something that's cringy and dig our toes in and be like, oh, I hate this, bad, bad, bad. But that's not going to make anything better. That's not going to fix any of the core issues. And I think we should be focused on making a better community in the situations that we have, because the ultimate test is of adaptation. It's the test of nature, essentially. Things adapt or they die. And I am team adapt over team die. So I say we adapt these traditions, these older traditions that we want to continue, into what can work for the next generation, for the next round of people, because that is our future. Like it or not, the Zoomers are not going away anytime soon. We are rising.
My final thoughts are we need to have a good understanding of where it is acceptable and where it's too far to be commodifying things, and where the benefits and harm come. And we can't just blanket statement say it is good or it is bad. We need to understand that there are parts of it that are harmful and painful and difficult, especially in terms of the urge to commodify your own practice and taking the magic out of the magic, but also the understanding that the more acceptance we have and the more normalization we have, the better it is for us ultimately. We can't have acceptance without some amount of commercialization. So we have to figure out where it's okay, where we draw the line of it is actually okay to see tarot cards at Target. Like you're gonna be fine. Your practice isn't getting any worse because it's still your practice at the end of the day. So trying to blame commercialization for why your practice doesn't feel authentic anymore is a choice to look outwards rather than looking inwards. So taking a good look at where you actually are feeling these things and how it's actually affecting your practice one way or another would be an important step here. You can't just blame it on all good, all bad, black and white thinking. As always, every single episode, you gotta have nuance.
I think we should rename to Nettle and Nuance.
Yes.
Nettle and nuance. It would be accurate. We use that word many times. I think my final thoughts are that I hate that this is a hot take, but like we live in a very capitalistic world, and if we want things to exist, they need to have money funneled into them, especially macrocosmically, like the occult community, if we want it to continue thriving and to survive the technological revolution of this century. It needs to have money funneled into it. And if that money is going to come from very rich and powerful corporations, like it's still money. And at the end of the day, we are the grassroots of the community. And so, like my hosts have said, like it's up to us to be ethical consumers and ethical creators. But at the end of the day, like the fact that people are funneling money to make our community bigger, like, I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as a really incredible thing. And it's unfortunate that there are, like Nike said, and like Georgina had said, there are things that can get lost in that. But the other thing is too, is like, maybe this is just my perspective as a young person, but like when I first started practicing 10 years ago, like the only thing you could find were like beginner books. And now if you walk through a Barnes and Noble, you can find things about Thelema, you can find things about chaos magic, you can find sex magic, you can find like every different type of folklore tradition that you could think of. Like the promulgation of our community and the popularization of witchcraft, like it has opened so many doors for so many more discussions that didn't exist before. And so I personally find that to be a positive thing. And so in this particular situation, as long as you're being mindful about how you're consuming and how you're creating, like, I think that this is all a good thing.
I think the final note that we should lead off with, I'm breaking our format by saying another thing.
Oh, yes.
But you all want witchcraft to stay in private and to keep silent, but I instead am taking on the Thelemic concept of promulgation. Everyone will be Thelemites. Crowley's pipe dream of Thelema replacing Christianity is coming. Even Bezos will be wearing a unicursal hexagram pendant soon, and that is the future that we should strive towards. Ra Horqueet willing.
And patrons. So, patrons, you help keep the show alive, and if you are the Bud tier or higher, we get to thank you by name for helping us out and making us have a very good time out here on the internet to be able to produce more of these talks. So, speaking of commercialization anyway, thank you to Amy, Evan, Hamda, Jonah, Lita, Robin, A Sociology of Tarot, Alejandra, Ali, Angry Pratt, Anna, Boxy, Bridget, Cirrus, Dot Nihilus, Doitsu, Freighter Zygmunt, Lee, Leo, Lilith, Marcelo, Marshall, Mike, MK Scorpio 89, Nauseated, Neon, Neva, because you told me how to say your name, Neva, Nicole, Pamela, The Lady Ghost, and Victoria. Thank you guys so much for all of your support.
If you want to support us and enable us to make more episodes and fund turning Bezos into a Thelemite, that is our new mission as a show. You can join our Patreon. Beyond helping Bezos discover the light of true will, you also get extended shows, pre-shows, extra episodes, allegedly, emphasis on allegedly, your name read out, which is obviously the most exciting thing, and a special Discord channel. I always forget to mention that one. But if you want to find me, I'm Georgina Rose or Dot Darling. I'm on this podcast, obviously. I've been doing this for the past 2 years, I think. But you can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Twitch, Telegram, Odyssey, and Vero. I don't really post on Vero, but I do have a Vero. And you can support me on Patreon and Ko-Fi.
I'm Nike. You can find me at Warrior Witch Nike basically everywhere. Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Patreon, because I post stuff. I've been taking a little bit of a social media hiatus on certain things, but I am around. Go follow me places.
And I am Anthony Wolfe. If you would like to connect with me, I am on Twitter and Instagram as well as at Anthony the Witch. I am taking a bit of a hiatus from Instagram right now, but I hope to get back into that soon. So we'll have some fun times.
And this has been Magnolias and Magic.